Hello, I believe we are now live. Hi everybody, and welcome to this webinar on how to think like a Roman emperor and the Stoicism of Marcus Aurelius. So first thing, please take a moment just to introduce yourself in the comments section, in the chat bit, which is in the right hand side of YouTube, and just say where you're from and let me know if you can hear me and see me okay. The preview looked slightly, just a little tiny bit choppy to me, but hopefully it doesn't really matter much. It should be good enough for the broadcast, but just let me know how it's coming across. The main thing is that you can hear me okay. My name is Donald Robertson, and I'm a cognitive behavioural therapist and a writer. I'm the author of 5 books on philosophy and psychotherapy, including Stoicism and the Art of Happiness, which I may have a copy of here. These are like literally my only visual aids. So Stoicism, the Art of Happiness, Build Your Resilience, which is kind of about third wave CBT and Stoicism. And this was my first book on Stoicism, The Philosophy of Cognitive Behavioural Therapy, Stoic Philosophy as Rational and Cognitive Psychotherapy, which wins the award for longest book title. Okay, so I also run the Stoic Week and Stoic Mindfulness and Resilience training courses for Modern Stoicism, which is a non-profit organisation, a multidisciplinary organisation. It's about 5 years old, that teaches people about Stoic philosophy. And I've just finished writing a new book on the life and Stoic philosophy of Marcus Aurelius, which I'll be announcing more about later. And I also run an online course on the Stoicism of Marcus Aurelius as well, which is called How to Think Like a Roman Emperor. And that's currently enrolling if you're interested, and I'll share a link here if you want to learn more about it. I'll say a little bit more, and then we'll get into talking about some techniques and stuff today. So I'm speaking to you right now from Nova Scotia in Canada, which is where I currently live. If you missed the start, just say hello in the comments and let me know where you're from, and also get your questions ready. So today's webinar, once again, on the Stoicism of Marcus Aurelius, particularly about how people today might take psychological techniques from Stoicism, particularly Marcus Aurelius, and apply them in daily life to emotional problems like anger and fear and sadness and coping with pain and stuff like that. It's going to be roughly 30 minutes, give or take 10. I'm not very good at estimating these things. So post any questions you have about the course or about what I'm saying today in the chat section on the right, and I'll try to answer those before I finish the broadcast. I think they're not permanent. Like on Facebook, I can answer them after I've finished. I think on YouTube Live, I have to get them quickly before we end the broadcast, which is kind of a little bit difficult sometimes, but... also, if you're having a discussion with other people, if you put @Donald in front, if there's a lot of comments in the chat, sometimes it can be hard for me to spot questions that are addressed to me, and I don't have a lot of time to look at it. So put @Donald in front of questions that you want to direct to me, and then I'm more likely to spot them. So I'm going to pause right now just to have a look at the chat, and we have some people. Walter's there. Hi, Walter. Someone from Phoenix. You guys can all hear me okay. Massachusetts. In Nova Scotia, cool. And we always have a few people from Nova Scotia, which is pretty cool. Dallas, Portland. Yeah, should I do this course now? I'll come back to that a little bit later then. So let me say a little bit about the course, then I'll answer some questions about it towards the end. The Roman Emperor course took me about a year to create, and it contains videos, audio, quizzes, downloads, discussions. It lasts 4 weeks. I'm an instructional designer, weirdly, as well as being a writer and a therapist. I kind of accidentally got into e-learning and instructional design like 15 years ago or something, because I was recruited as part of a research project for the UK Department for the Environment, and we were designing, it was called Coping with Noise, and we designed online courses based on CBT for stress management, and we published research on that. And then I delivered training courses for therapists, so I used blended learning, and I brought e-learning into the classroom training that we did. So I've kind of been doing e-learning for a long time, and instructional design and stuff like that. So this course is kind of contains a lot of different formats to kind of keep you engaged. So there's audio, there's video. It's 4 weeks long, like I said. It's all about, though, how stories from Marcus Aurelius' life can help us, as I like to put it, put a human face on Stoicism. so we can better understand how to apply the philosophical doctrines and the psychological techniques ourselves in modern living. There's lots of material in there, so today I'm just going to give a kind of overview of some of the psychological techniques, because that's probably the most common thing I get asked about, and it's the thing that I like talking about most. It's like my little bias that I'm interested in the psychological practices. I would say the therapy, the Stoics actually called it therapy, like therapia, believe it or not. Some people aren't aware of that. The Stoics used the medical model, they called it a therapy. And in this book, actually, I listed 18, I just checked that today, like there are 18 Stoic techniques, distinct psychological techniques that are listed in there. But of course, it kind of depends how you choose arbitrarily to carve them up, and which ones you combine together or which ones you distinguish. So, roughly you could say there are 18. In the 10 years since I wrote that book, just under 10 years, I've only spotted one technique that I missed, tucked away in Epictetus actually, and I'll come back and mention that at the end. I'll tell you a little bit about the technique that I missed. So if I'm going to do revised second editions very soon of these other books, the Hodder Teach Yourself ones. Probably not going to do a second edition of this, I don't have one planned anyway, but if I did, I'd add this technique from Epictetus in that I missed. Sharks. So, what are the main Stoic psychological techniques? After a bit of a build-up, I want to get right into the guts of it, because it's what I really care about. So the first one, I've got weird names for these techniques that have evolved over time, and some of them come from the jargon in the Stoic texts themselves, and some of them comes from terminology that we use in psychotherapy. And I kind of, at first I was a bit hesitant to use these jargon labels for techniques, but I found that some of them kind of caught on. So people actually, seem to, once they get over the initial psychobabble, feel reaction. People kind of like to have names for the different techniques. And the first one I call Stoic catharsis, because that's the term that Marcus Aurelius actually uses. But I also often call it cognitive distancing, because that's the term that we use in modern cognitive therapy. So there's a technique that Marcus describes as catharsis or purification, nothing to do whatsoever with what Freud meant by catharsis, but this is catharsis in the original, the true philosophical meaning of the word. Catharsis means cleansing, purifying. So I would say this is the most important psychological technique in Stoicism, arguably, depending on how you look at things. So that's why I'm starting with it. It's a pretty big deal. Marcus talks about it a lot. Epictetus goes on and on about it. And I would say it resembles what we now call cognitive distancing in cognitive therapy, which happens to be very similar to what behaviour therapists call verbal diffusion. And it's easy to explain in a sense. In some ways it's a slippery concept, but there's an easy place to start in explaining it. Epictetus famously said in the handbook, it's not events that upset us, but our judgments about events. It's not events that upset us, but our judgments about events. Now, Albert Ellis, one of the pioneers of cognitive therapy, developed an approach called rational emotive behaviour therapy in the 1950s. And Ellis used to teach that quote to his clients, and generations of subsequent CBT practitioners would also tell that quote to their clients. I give them handouts with that quote from Epictetus in it. In fact, one of the things that kind of initially got me really interested in Stoicism was the fact that I kept hearing this quotation in the CBT field, and it made it obvious there was some overlap between Stoicism and CBT, but it wasn't an area that many people had written about. It wasn't very well developed, and I realised there was way more to that overlap than I'd initially understood. And actually this quote in itself is vastly more significant than I think I'd initially appreciated. So Marcus also calls this a separation or a withdrawal of the mind from external events. There's a couple of different ways that this gets described or looked at, and sometimes it's not obvious. I think that they're referring to arguably the same thing. He imagines circumscribing the mind, like drawing a line around the mind or a line between external events and the judgments that we impose on them. And the point really that he's making is to say that we're naturally forgetful of a kind of what you could call projection. It's human nature that we project our values onto the world around us. This applies to other aspects of thinking, but the Stoics are mainly concerned with the value judgments that we make. They think that's really the key thing in terms of emotional disturbance and our problems in life. So they're mainly concerned with this idea that when we think something's terrible, that's really coming from us. Like, we're making the judgment that it's terrible. The thing in itself is neither good nor bad. There's no good or evil in that sense in nature. It just does stuff. And then we view it as good or bad. We impose values, we project values, but that's not how we experience it. We experience our values as blended, as merged with external reality, so that it seems like we just see a bad thing, like we see like an amazing, inspiring, desirable thing. And the Stoics want us to realize that we're kind of blending ourselves. We're blending our own judgments, fusing them with reality. And they want us to kind of separate this veneer of value judgments from reality and take more ownership for it, to realize it's something that's under our control. Hamlet said there's nothing good or bad, but thinking makes it so. And that's almost something the Stoics could agree with. Sounds more like something a skeptic would say, but the Stoics would say, well, there's nothing good or bad in the external world, but thinking makes it appear so. The Stoics believe that virtue is good and vice is bad, but actually those are qualities of our thinking itself. In the outer world, they would say there are things that we may prefer or disprefer naturally, but those values themselves don't exist in external reality, and they think it's incredibly important to remind ourselves of that. As soon as we forget that and kind of passively perceive our values, we take them too seriously, as if they're just out there, as if this guy just is a bastard or this woman just is a bitch, like, rather than thinking those are just names we're calling them, judgments we're imposing on them. We disempower ourselves, but it's so deeply ingrained in human nature that we fuse these things together and forget our ownership of them. So the Stoics, Marcus actually describes our value judgments as the metaphor he uses is that our opinions are like sunlight, and they're like beams of light that we shine onto objects and illuminate them. We project our values onto external things. Now, Aaron Beck, the founder of cognitive therapy, the way he liked to explain cognitive distancing to clients was to use an analogy that kind of reminds me a little bit of that. He would say, imagine that you're wearing coloured glasses. We all know the expression looking at the world through rose-tinted glasses, but obviously in therapy, often the clients are looking at the world through shitty-coloured, depressive glasses, or threatening, anxiety-provoking glasses, or angry glasses. Right, so we imagine you're looking at the world through tinted glasses. Well, if that's all you've known, after a while you might just start to assume that that's the way that things look. We look at the world through shitty coloured glasses, we assume it's just a shitty world. And the difference between, like, the way he defined cognitive distancing is saying, look, it's the difference between looking through the glasses and just seeing the world tinted in that way by the lenses or by our value judgments, and taking the glasses off and looking at them, or just noticing that we're wearing them. So looking at the glasses, rather than looking through them. And that's what cognitive distancing really refers to. It's the ability to view psychological events as objects, like looking at the glasses as objects rather than treating them as a perspective, looking through them. So realizing that our value judgments are activities that are going on in our mind, and taking a step back from them, if you like, basically just noticing that we're doing it, is the first step in gaining cognitive distance. And cognitive therapists used to say that this was kind of a prerequisite to most other techniques in cognitive therapy. Beck's cognitive therapy, very simply, kind of begins with asking where's the evidence for that, and a bunch of other restructuring questions about the thoughts that we have, depressed thoughts, anxious thoughts, questioning their validity, or their accuracy rather, and also maybe their helpfulness. But to do that, we need to spot what those thoughts are, and they need to be up for debate. We need to treat them as hypotheses that could be right or wrong, rather than fusing them with reality. So we have to defuse them first of all, before we can even really begin evaluating them, arguably. So Beck saw this as a kind of precursor of therapy. But subsequent therapists in what's called the third wave of CBT, who do mindfulness and acceptance-based cognitive therapy, would say, well, actually, this technique alone seems to be much more powerful than had previously been assumed, and actually, even used on its own, if used very comprehensively, systematically, it can become the central technique of therapy. And in Stoicism, I would say it's actually more central than it was in early cognitive therapy. So in that respect, Stoicism is a little bit more like more recent developments in the field of psychotherapy in that respect. So Epictetus also says that, for instance, in response, in his handbook, he tells his students that when they experience a bad or a catastrophic impression that's upsetting or troubling to them, something awful's happened, he would say to the impression, like literally talk to yourself. There's a lot of that in Stoicism. I'm going to come back to it. So actually, literally say to yourself, or to the impression itself, you are just an impression and not at all the things you claim to represent. That sentence is a little bit tricky to translate into English. It could also be translated as you're just an appearance and not at all the thing appearing to me, if that makes sense. But it's cognitive distancing, definitely. First of all, he's apostrophizing, so he's talking to the thought. Apostrophizing is like when we kind of address something rather than a person, like addressing a thought in this case, as if you're talking to a person. That helps us gain cognitive distance because we're now viewing that impression, that thought, as if it were an object, like taking the glasses off and looking at them, as if we were talking to the glasses. Hey, you're just a pair of glasses. Like, it's acknowledging them as a separate entity rather than just looking through them and fusing with reality. You're an impression that something bad has happened, something catastrophic, something upsetting has happened. You're not the same as the thing itself. The map isn't the same as the territory, as Kozubsky used to say. So there he's defusing the impression from external reality. That's a really clear example. But the other quote that I mentioned, it's not things pragmata, it's not things that upset us, but our judgments about them, is very well known today, very well known in cognitive therapy. That quote itself is very well known in the ancient world, actually, and Marcus alludes to that quote in particular a number of times throughout the meditations in different forms. He applies it in different ways to different types of emotion. So, for example, if somebody says something that offends you, you might remind yourself that the words themselves are just noises, right? And what's upsetting you ultimately are your own judgments that it's offensive or unbearable. And also, after he says this thing, it's not events that upset us but our judgments about them. The next thing that Epictetus goes on to say is, for example, Socrates wasn't frightened even of death, but other people are. And so another way of approaching distancing is to say, well, although you see this as terrible and offensive and unbearable, someone else might view it differently. And we'll come round to this again from a number of different perspectives. One is the Stoics considering role models of wise men, or what a hypothetical ideal wise man would do. And that also helps them gain cognitive distance, because they'll remind themselves there are multiple perspectives that could be adopted on the same event. So that's a kind of mental flexibility, or a loosening up of our value judgments that comes from exploring these role models. Such as Socrates serves for Epictetus and his students. Okay, so let me just check in with the chat. You guys are still hearing me loud and clear. Good. You're following? Are you all following me okay? Does this seem interesting? Will we go into it in a little bit more detail? So another popular technique for the Stoics is what I would call postponement. It's very similar to a bunch of techniques found in modern therapy, in anger management, and the treatment of worry, for example. And the Epictetus talks about this multiple times as well, and we find it in other ancient authors too, particularly when they're talking about anger. So it's the idea that when our emotions are activated, it's often hard to use these other perspective shifting techniques and to change things. It's hard to think rationally when you're upset. So Epictetus says, look, if it's a really strong emotion and it's hard for you to do something about it, take a time out and say that you're not going to think about it or respond to it. Just kind of shrug it off and say, I'll come back to you later. And when your feelings have calmed down and you've relaxed, then you can think about the problem that made you angry more rationally, more clearly, and more flexibly, looking at it from different perspectives. So sometimes people say, yeah, but what if I'm too upset to do all this Stoic stuff? Take time out, do a postponement strategy, come back to it later when you've calmed down. That's the strategy that Epictetus gives. That's the answer he gives to that question. Another technique that Pierre Hadot calls objective representation, or sometimes it's called physical definition, and so it's very closely related to catharsis. Some of these techniques are cognitive, they're to do with our perspective or our thinking. Some of them are actually verbal, the things that we say. Some of them are imaginal, the things that we visualize. So objective representation is a Stoic rhetoric technique, and in Stoic rhetoric it's a curious beast because ancient writers said, well, the Stoics are almost doing the opposite of traditional rhetoric. Rather than using flowery emotive language, they were in favour of speaking in a very plain, simple, concise, objective manner. So they have what they call a rhetoric, but it's almost anti-rhetoric. Their goal is just to represent things as objectively as possible, whereas an orator in the ancient world, often his goal was to win praise, to impress people, to whip up their emotions. Stoics kind of want to de-escalate the emotions and view things as objectively as possible, generally speaking. There's some similarity between this and what cognitive therapists today call decatastrophizing, or downgrading the perceived severity of a situation by viewing it more objectively, and also maybe considering ways that we could potentially cope with it. Stick to the facts, in other words. So Beck, for instance, gets clients to write decatastrophizing scripts where they describe an upsetting situation, but in more down-to-earth, plain, less emotive language. And you could see this as being like a natural philosopher in the ancient world trying in objective terms to describe the heavens or an earthquake, natural phenomena, or a physician listing symptoms that someone else is experiencing in a kind of detached, objective way. Or Marcus also compares it weirdly to an artist describing the features of something from a more detached aesthetic perspective. We talked today about an attitude of scientific detachment or studied indifference, but the key thing here is this can actually be a verbal technique. You could practice writing down descriptions or rephrasing descriptions of things in your mind that allow you to gain catharsis or cognitive distance by making sure that you remove all the value judgments basically and the kind of emotive language and just describe the facts. There's a related technique that I call depreciation by analysis, because that's the term that an early 20th century psychotherapist used, and it's kind of a cool name. Like a child who pulls apart a toy and then just looks at the broken pieces and says, is that all that it was? Is that all that's inside this? In addition to describing things objectively, we can analyse them into their components, and when we do that, it tends to change our emotional reaction to them. And I think there's a cool way of explaining that psychologically that I'll come back to in a moment. Marcus says that his imperial purple robe, almost sacred thing, is just sheep's wool dyed in fermented shellfish mucus, which is what the purple dye was made from. There's a really cool thing that Napoleon said as well. Supposedly Napoleon said a throne is just a bench covered in velvet. So really kind of taking away the veneer from it and viewing it in a very objective, banal way. Marcus also talks about spoiling the pleasure of a melody, the spell it casts over our mind by focusing on each note in isolation. But this is only applied to unhealthy desires and emotions, to break habits of thinking when we want to change how we feel. When dealing with upsetting people, Marcus says we should do something similar, but it's more like empathic understanding rather than a sort of objective analysis. We should try to enter their minds, he says, put ourselves in their shoes. Imagine their daily routine, someone that's offended you, their life as a whole, their underlying goals and values, where they're coming from, who they're trying to impress in life. So he's shifting perspective again, which is important. He's introducing psychological flexibility, looking at the other person from a number of perspectives, but also broadening and deepening his understanding. Because when we do that, it often is capable of diluting our emotional responses. And that's because when people are angry or anxious, often their attention becomes narrowed and they become particularly focused on cues for anxiety or anger in their environment. And when we do that, it's a kind of selective awareness. We take things out of context when we're upset. We literally become much more narrowly focused, like a laser beam, on the bits of the situation that upset us. When we broaden our awareness and view things in a more rounded way, these particular parts that upset us kind of become diluted, because we're reacting to them along with a bunch of other cues that, essentially have a tendency to damp down the effect. So we're kind of reversing this narrowing of attention, and a lot of Stoic techniques involve broadening or deepening awareness. And the Stoics literally also thought that emotional distress was a kind of shrinking of the mind or awareness, and the reason was an expanding of the mind. That's where the word magnanimity comes from. The Stoics call it megalosouche, like literally having a big soul, having a broadened awareness. Now, the Stoics also contemplate the transience of external events. Nothing lasts forever. This too shall pass. So that's one of Marcus's favourite techniques as well, possibly influenced by his reading of the pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus, who he quotes almost as much as he quotes Epictetus. So this is a little bit like time projection and some other techniques in modern cognitive therapy. So I find it very useful when someone's upset about something they're worrying about or dwelling on, to keep asking them what next, and then what happens, and then what's likely to happen. Because people tend to freeze images at the most upsetting part, again, like this narrowing of focus onto the distressing cues. And one way of broadening our awareness is temporal, so saying, well, what happens next, and then what happens next? And if we think about the event as having a beginning, middle, and an end, we also kind of dilute it. It's no longer like an intense piece of bright red dye, but it's like a piece of red dye that's been dropped into a glass of water, if you like. It's combined with a bunch of other less distressing cues now. But the Stoics would say that's a more truthful way of looking at things. It's more rounded and complete. Selective awareness is like a lie of omission. Like, we only can become that upset about things when we leave other things out. So yeah, something really bad is going to happen, but then I'll probably move on from it, and I'll be upset for a week or two, but then I'll gradually get over it and I'll slowly rebuild things. And if I look at things in that broader perspective, it seems less catastrophic, less overwhelming in many cases. So another similar technique called time projection, one form of time projection, closely related to this, that I like to do in therapy, would be to say, well, say for example you have a relationship breakup, it's naturally distressing, but if you imagine yourself in 10, 20 years time from now, looking back on it, how will you feel when you look back on relationships that you had when you were a teenager? Like, from a distance, like, do you feel as upset about them? And then, why shouldn't you feel now as you would in 20 years time looking back on it? It's interesting just to explore these altered perspectives. Stoic functional analysis, another technique, similar to what we call cost-benefit analysis in cognitive therapy, possibly originated with a famous parable from a sophist who was friends with Socrates, called Prodicus, called The Choice of Hercules, about Hercules as a young man finding himself in the woods at a fork in the road and choosing between virtue and vice. So Stoics have a very general strategy that they often like to think of things as dichotomies. Either something's under our control or it isn't. And in stressful situations, sometimes it can be useful to think of black or white decisions, to kind of simplify decision making. Sometimes that can be potentially helpful. And so one way they do that is a kind of functional analysis, or thinking about the consequences of different courses of action. And mainly you could call it between virtue and vice, but it's probably easier to say that in many cases what they're thinking about is, what would happen if on the left-hand path I was guided by my passions, my fear, my anger, my sadness, allowed that to run my life? Where would that get me, like a week from now, a month, a year from now? And then what would happen if I took a step back from those feelings and I was guided by wisdom or reason or self-discipline or endurance, the virtues? Like, where would that get me? And the idea of the path is that those paths will probably diverge further and further and further as time goes on. And that as we look at it that way, will amplify our motivation for choosing one over the other. So that technique is often used early in therapy to help clients build motivation to make challenging or difficult changes in their behaviour. There's another technique called the reserve clause, hupexeresis. It's a technical term that occurs that's hard to translate as well, but basically it's easy to explain. It's a caveat that we attach to things that we do. So the Stoics, if they were undertaking any action, would implicitly think, if nothing prevents me, if God is willing or fate permitting. So they prepare themselves in advance for either success or failure. And Cicero portrays the Stoic Cato of Utica, describing this by using a famous analogy of an archer. So the archer fires an arrow, and the Stoic archer takes responsibility for the way that he fires it, and he has to have a target to aim at. But once the arrow has flown the bow, he is indifferent to whether it hits the target or not, because from that point onwards it's partly in the hands of fate. So he takes full responsibility for the bit that's under his control, and then he's detached from the outcome. Nevertheless, he has to have a target to actually aim at. So the reserve clause is the way that we pursue an external goal with emotional detachment, if that makes sense. It's this kind of paradox of Stoicism. Stoics try really hard to achieve goals, but nevertheless with a certain kind of emotional detachment from the outcome. They're not upset by missing the target. A similar, kind of related technique is premeditation of adversity. It's described a lot in Seneca, but also in Epictetus. Marcus kind of touches on it. And the Stoics say every day we should imagine exile, poverty, disease, death, betrayal, and prepare ourselves to cope with these things. Now, this is similar to a technique in therapy we call imaginal exposure, really a whole bunch of different techniques that involve, in different ways, imagining upsetting events so we can cope better with them. The main reason for doing that is that we now know that if you imagine an anxiety-provoking situation in a controlled manner for long enough, your anxiety will tend to naturally abate. And that's one of the most robustly established techniques in the field of psychotherapy, habituation or imaginal exposure. And the Stoics seem to have been aware of that. They knew that for a judgment to be upsetting, a thought to be upsetting, this is terrible, they believed it had to be fresh, and that as it ages it becomes less upsetting. And this seems to be implicit in the use of this technique. Actually, another author, maybe it's either Plutarch or Philo, spells that rationale out, one of the non-Stoics. Spells out this idea that the premeditation of upsetting events has to do with facing them long enough for the emotions to wear off. But actually the main reason for Stoics doing this isn't for the emotions to abate naturally, but even more important to them was to rehearse viewing the event with indifference, which would mean rehearsing Stoic catharsis or cognitive distancing. It's an opportunity to rehearse cognitive distancing in advance. And when we prepare ourselves for a range of upsetting situations in advance of them actually happening, by pretending they're happening, by make-believe, by imagination, that's a powerful tool for building emotional resilience. And the Stoics have a therapy, but they're actually more akin to what we now call resilience building training. Like the Stoicism has more of a focus on preventative psychological training rather than remedial stuff, although they cover both. There's another famous Stoic technique called the view from above. That's a term that Hadot gives to it, one of the main modern scholars of Stoicism. And the view from above is when we visualise things from high above, as if from a hot air balloon or a helicopter looking down on events. And again, it's a broadening of perspective. There are many references to this technique in the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, especially towards the end of the book, where he seems to shift his focus onto it more. That could be like the gods from Mount Olympus looking down, like literally a helicopter view, or it could be more of a cosmological vision of the whole universe and how small the Earth is within the vastness of space, and how small the present moment in time is in the whole expanse of universal history. So it gets pretty cosmic. But again, it's this broadening of perspective so that the cues are still there. We're still thinking about the existence of our current situation, but it's kind of swamped by all of the rest of reality. And the Stoics would say, yeah, but that's the truth. Like the truth is that this is only a speck in time and space, and we only are able to feel so strongly about things, in a sense, through a kind of lie of omission, by kind of shutting all this other stuff out. The contemplation of death is an important Stoic technique. I'm just going to touch on some of these other things more briefly. Every morning could be your last. When you awaken, it could be for the last time, Seneca says. Every evening could be the last time you go to sleep. And Marcus very frequently contemplates his own death. And it's really to remind himself not to delay the most important things in life. Carpe diem, as Horace says, seize the day. Horace was influenced by Stoicism, by the way. Not seizing the day for pleasure, but for doing the most important things in life, for wisdom, living wisely, living honourably, do it now. Remember you could die at any moment. And in fact, there's much more to the contemplation of death than this. It goes all the way back to Socrates and beyond. Socrates even said the practice of philosophy itself is a protracted contemplation of death, a preparation for death. Melite thanatou, he calls it, meditation on death. Contemplation of virtue is also an important Stoic technique. The Stoics Marcus frequently asks himself, in the face of any adversity, what virtue has nature given me to cope with this situation? What psychological resources do I have? What would be a good way of coping with it, a better way of coping? What strengths do I have that I can draw on? And one way of accessing those virtues is to shift perspective and do what we call modelling in modern therapy, like by asking yourself, what would I praise in others? What would Socrates do? What would Zeno do? What would Epictetus do? Or today we might say, what would Marcus do? And that becomes another Stoic technique, which is called the contemplation of the sage, or sophos. And that links to something called value living, which I mentioned I was going to touch on briefly today, but I haven't got time to say a lot about it. But there's a difference between, in modern psychology, it's considered for many clients, particularly those suffering from depression, therapeutic to shift their focus away from the achievement of external goals and more onto extrinsic goals, similar to the Stoic concept of virtue, onto the quality of their own actions. When we try to achieve external goals, we kind of set ourselves up for anxiety. We're always comparing our progress against them. They're always at a distance as well. We may or may not achieve them. But the Stoics want us to place more value on the way that we do things. So you, like the archer, you still have a target or a goal to aim for, but what's more important to you than when you achieve it or not, than if you achieve it or not, is the way that you go about seeking it. Like, are you, Stoics exercise not just to lose weight, but mainly so that they become the sort of person who is self-disciplined and exercises, the sort of person that they would praise or admire in life themselves, so they can learn to admire their own character and take some satisfaction from the fact that they've shown strength of character, whether or not they actually succeeded. There's a beautiful quote in a play about Cato, 18th century play called Cato, a Tragedy, that says something along the lines of, it's more important than achieving victory is deserving victory. Cato himself, of Cato of Utica, didn't achieve victory in the civil war against Caesar, but he was admired because he deserved victory. And it's an interesting way of looking at it. So valued living is about identifying what the character values are that you want to exhibit in life, what sort of person you want to be, a question that Marcus is always asking himself, and setting aside time during the day to be the sort of person that you want to be. Often that means pursuing certain goals, but those goals are now of secondary importance. They're there, but they're not the most important thing. The most important thing is the type of person you are, the character you exhibit, the way that you go about pursuing them. Are you a creative person, an affectionate person? Are you a good parent? Are you a good friend? One way of understanding it is in terms of roles or in terms of virtues that we want to possess. And when people specifically look at their daily schedule and how much time they're spending doing these valued things, literally in the evening reviewing it can, you have to set a schedule and literally set time aside, but doing that can make a big difference to your quality of life. So you might say to a client in therapy, like, what are the things that you really want your life to stand for? Or what do you admire in other people? And they might say, well, creativity is a big thing for me. The Stoics might not view creativity in itself as a virtue, but many people kind of like that's what they come up with. And then you might say to them, well, how much time do you spend each day doing creative stuff? Usually it's none or very little. And then you might say, well, like, what would happen if you just spent another 5 minutes a day doing something? What would be some examples of creative stuff that you could do? Even if you write a poem and then throw it away, at least you would be exhibiting creativity. Like, you would be spending some time on it. Even if it was only 5 minutes a day. Small changes make big differences. And particularly with valued living, just doing a little bit more often can really affect people's mood. So I wanted to say a little bit about that because somebody had kind of brought this up previously in a conversation. The other simple thing I wanted to mention is the Stoics often use self-instructions or coping statements, as we would refer to them today, maxims, slogans, verbal formula that they memorize and repeat to themselves. These things all connect together. So these verbal formula partly come through contemplation of a sage. What was Socrates or Zeno's attitude to this problem? What was their thinking? What would they say to themselves? And then the Stoics would write this down, and then they would memorize it and repeat it to themselves. The Meditations of Marcus Aurelius can be seen as a collection of these kind of sayings to some extent. Like, he's repeating over and over slogans, formula that he's trying to memorize. The clue to that is in actually the title of the book. It wasn't called the Meditations. The earliest manuscript that we have of it carries the title To Himself. And that phrase in Greek is used in the first passage of the second book, which many scholars believe is actually the beginning of the book. That book 1 is kind of like a preface or an appendix that was written at a later time and put at the front. So 2.1, which is actually probably one of the most famous and much loved passages in the meditation, in a sense is perhaps the opening passage. And in it he uses the same phrase that was given as a title to the original manuscript, to himself. These are things that Marcus literally says to himself. They're self-instructions or coping statements that he repeats to himself. I believe that the Meditations, which we don't know exactly when it was written, but for reasons I'll go into in the course, I believe it was probably written from sometime after 170 AD and probably finished before 175 AD, so basically during the First Marcomannic War. And that was probably just after Marcus Aurelius' main Stoic tutor, his mentor, his personal mentor, and his right-hand man at Rome, Junius Rusticus, had died. And I like to speculate that maybe that's more than coincidence, that perhaps Marcus isolated from his friends and tutors on the northern frontier, his main Stoic mentor just having passed away, a guy he was probably corresponding with via letters, that Marcus then decided, I'm going to start writing a journal called the Meditations. I'm going to become my own therapist, my own Stoic mentor. I'm going to take over the role of Junius Rusticus now that he's passed away. And I like to think of that as a kind of transformational step, a new phase in Marcus's psychological, spiritual development as a Stoic. And I said, I'll give you one example actually of one of these coping statements, a really neat one. It may be a quote from another philosopher, but at one point Marcus talks a little bit about ideas that look like they come from Epictetus and Heraclitus. And then he sums them up in a saying that's only really 4 or 6 words long in Greek. So it's very compressed, it's very condensed. And in English it would be like, the universe is change, life is opinion, or universe change, life opinion. Like, it's really condensed. And what he means is everything is constantly in flux. You can't step into the same river twice. It's the philosophy of Heraclitus. Like, he was viewing things as transient, like Buddhists' doctrine of impermanence. Everything is changing, like universe change, cosmos change, he says. life opinion. The word he uses for opinion is actually really denotes value judgments. So he means the quality of your life is determined by your value judgments, which is this saying of Epictetus: it's not things that upset us, but our judgments about them. Marcus compresses this into a couple of words, and probably use it as a kind of self-instruction or coping statement. And the final thing that I wanted to mention, I've gone on a little bit longer than I planned, but so I hope you're getting some value from that though. The last thing I said I'd come back to is this technique that I forgot about, or I'd overlooked when I was writing this book. And so the Stoics write consolation letters. Other philosophers wrote consolation letters, but the Stoics specialised in this kind of therapeutic practice of writing letters to their friends, consoling them over bereavement or other problems in life. Seneca wrote like half a dozen or something that we have. I think we have some from Plutarch as well, and there's a few other ones kicking about from other ancient sources. And I thought that's an interesting technique. It's an example of Stoicism being employed, a bit like a therapy. These letters giving people Stoic advice and ways of looking at things to help them cope. Epictetus tells us that one of his heroes, a member of the Stoic opposition to Domitian, a senator called Paconius Agrippinus, who features quite prominently at the beginning of the discourses. He's a guy that's worth looking into, actually. So Epictetus looks up to this guy as a Stoic from previous generation, and he says that Agrippinus, when he was confronted with a problem, exile, disease, being maligned verbally abused by other people, his reputation being undermined, and I think these are probably things that actually happened to Agrippinus. He would write a letter to himself, and Epictetus actually I think refers to this as a eulogy or a praising speech or letter. And I imagine it must have been similar to the Stoic consolation letters that survive today, but he wrote it to himself. A little bit. The strange thing is it would be therefore somewhere between the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, which is to himself, but it's shorter, it's more aphoristic, and the consolation letters of Seneca, which are longer, but written to other people. So Paconius Agrippinus seemed to write these longer letters, or we would call them scripts today, to himself, praising situations, a bit like a decatastrophizing script, where you might also write a coping plan, explaining how you'd cope with something. The biggest example in his life was that he was sent into exile, and so Epictetus seems to imply he wrote a letter to himself about his exile, saying, it's an opportunity to exercise strength of character and virtue. So putting a kind of positive spin on it, not deceiving himself, but basically, reviewing the situation objectively and highlighting opportunities to turn it into something positive. And that's an interesting technique. It's not clearly documented in the ancient sources, but there we are told that this guy actually did it. There's a cool anecdote about Agrippinus that when he was about to have lunch with his friends when he was sent into exile, and his response was just to kind of shrug and say, "Oh well, we shall take our lunch in Aricia," which was the next stop along the road out of Rome into exile. So he's basically saying, they interrupted his lunch to tell him he was being exiled, and he just said, "Well, that's cool, I guess we'll just have a picnic in the countryside on the way." Epictetus was blown away by that. That stuck in his mind as an example of a stoic sage responding. So I hope that fate permitting has been of some value to you. I do like to ramble about these things, so apologies for going slightly over time. Thank you very much for coming along. I look forward to seeing you on the course, How to Think Like a Roman Emperor. I'll post a link later under the video once the recording goes up. If you're interested in enrolling, there's currently $50 off the normal price if you register now, and you also get 3 free ebooks about Marcus Aurelius that I've created and had edited, and I'll be replying to questions in the comments thread for a little while. But from the live broadcast now, it's goodbye once again from me here in Nova Scotia. Goodbye.